Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our live discussion. I'm your host, Lokman Karadag, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you join us for what promises to be an incredibly fascinating and frankly mind-blending conversation today. And in this program, we are peeling back the layers of one of the world's most enigmatic nations, North Korea. For decades, the DPRK has largely been viewed through a lens of isolation. But what if the public image only tells us parts of the story? What if North Korea's past is far more complex, more interconnected, and more globally engaged than we have ever been led to believe? Joining us today to challenge our perception and illuminate this hiding history is a truly outstanding scholar, Dr. Benjamin R. Young. Dr. Yang is an expert researcher and analyst of North Korea, irregular warfare, and US East Asia relations. He's currently a tenure track assistant professor for intelligence studies at Fayetteville State University and was a Stanton Foundation Nuclear Security Fellow at RAND Corporation from 2024 to 2025. He has taught at the US Naval War College and is author of the compelling book Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader, North Korea and the Third World. Dr. Yang's work takes us on an extraordinary journey from Pyongyang's surprising alliance with the Black Panther Party to its cultural diplomacy in Africa and even into the emotional geopolitics that drive its foreign policy. In this live interview, we will delve into the fascinating concept of guerrilla internationalism, uncover the motivation behind North Korea's global engagement, explore the link between its past guerrilla tactics and modern-day cyber warfare, and seek to understand the historical trauma that underlines its nuclear drive. Dr. Yang, thank you for making the time to share your expertise with us. It is an honor to have you on the stream. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And Dr. Ben, let me start with one question. With your book, Guns, Guerrillas, and Great Leaders, suggests a very active international North Korea. When most people think of the DPRK, they think of isolation. How do you reconcile the public image of the isolated North Korea with its past reality and as a major player in the third world?
Yeah, so thank you for that great question. So I think that one of the kind of the running themes throughout my work, whether it's academic scholarship or more of the public-facing journalistic scholarship, is that North Korea is widely, I think, misunderstood as an isolationist, secretive regime. It's isolationist in the international rules-based liberal order, whatever you want to call it, the Western system, but it hasn't always been isolated in different systems. So the non-aligned movement, that kind of the anti-colonial bloc of global South countries during the Cold War, and even in the socialist bloc during the Cold War era. It's just that North Korea has been historically and now currently isolated in the so-called international liberal order. And I think that we tend to look at North Korea from a very Western-centric perspective, and we project our own biases towards North Korea. With that being said, there are some things that the West gets right about North Korea, that it's a human rights disaster zone, that it is a dictatorship. But what we really don't understand well is North Korean strategy and North Korean foreign policy. And that's a lot of where my work comes into play.
And can you a little bit define the guerrilla internationalism and explain the motivation behind Pyongyang sending military advisors to countries like Zimbabwe, Grenada, and various African nations in the 60s, especially 60s and 70s?
Yeah, so during the Cold War era, North Korea was actually an active aid donor. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea became the recipient of all sorts of UN and other international humanitarian aid. But during the 60s and 70s, North Korea sent military advisors, engineers, technical experts, agricultural experts to a lot of these developing countries, because North Korea at that time was actually doing pretty well in terms of economic output and GDP indicators. It was widely seen as a kind of a socialist bastion of self-sufficiency and self-reliance. And so that's where that's where that term guerrilla internationalism that I came up with. It was actually the title for my dissertation, which later became my first book, Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader. And North Korea, when it comes to internationalism, it was really kind of riding on the socialist tradition of socialist internationalism. When Karl Marx said workers of the world unite, this was something that was kind of put in state policy for the Soviet Union and became adopted by a lot of so-called communist countries. And North Korea kind of had its own spirit of internationalism, in which it saw itself as an anti-colonial stalwart, and it saw itself as being a champion of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism in many different areas of the world. So you would never have thought that North Korea would be active building farms in sub-Saharan Africa, but there was a few model farms that North Korean experts built. And so this is where I come up with this term guerrilla internationalism. But it really fades after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, and even in the 1980s, the North Korean economy just couldn't support some of these activities. But in the 90s was when this stream of internationalism and North Korean foreign policy and external behavior really just collapsed. It was no longer there, and it's largely because they couldn't afford it, and a lot of their international activities became basically totally focused on making money for the regime and bolstering the coffers of Kim Jong-il, who came into power after 1994 and the death of the founding leader Kim Il-sung.
And that is a more interesting connection with the United States, I think. Your work details the Black Partners Party relations with North Korea. And this is a genuinely surprising piece of history. What did the Black Partners see the Juche ideology? And what did the Pyongyang hope to gain from the relationship with an American civil rights movement group?
Yeah. So that was my master's thesis topic, the Black Panther Party's relationship with North Korea. And it all started from me actually looking at the Black Panther newspaper and seeing a portrait of Kim Il-sung. And there was a lot of research that had been done at the time on Maoist China's relationship with the Black Panther Party and Cuba's relationship with Black radical activists, but there was nothing really on North Korea. And I thought, okay, what were these activities? And so from about 1969 to 1971, Black Panther Party leader Eldridge Cleaver, who really kind of had quite a few feuds with Huey Newton, who's the more famous Black Panther Party leader. He led the international section of the Panthers, and he visited North Korea on 2 separate occasions for this journalist conference. And in North Korea, he loved it. He in his diaries, he wrote about how great it was, that it was this socialist paradise. I think it was kind of like, rose-tinted glasses, but North Korea saw itself as this kind of stalwart of anti-colonialism, and their state newspaper, the Rodong Shinmun, even published a few articles basically proclaiming solidarity with the Black Panther Party and calling for the end of racial discrimination in the U.S. And that is quite remarkable for a so-called, hermit kingdom to be so aware of events happening in the U.S., and specifically a small Black power group such as the Black Panthers, which at the time that was widely seen in the U.S. as the so-called greatest security threat. That's what FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover referred to them as. And so the Black Panthers, they found allies all over the world: Cuba, China, Algeria, and North Korea. So as part of their kind of international alliance structure. And Eldridge Cleaver's wife at the time, Kathleen Cleaver, even gave birth in a Pyongyang maternity hospital. And so that there was this kind of solidarity built on personal ties, but there was also the ideological aspect of as well. And one thing is that North Korea, they promoted this ideology of Juche, which typically what people refer to as like self-reliance or self-sufficiency. And I think there's a lot of poor information out there about Juche because it sometimes gets shortened to just self-reliance, or sometimes also gets, I think, misunderstood as just being a total sham doctrine. The way I like to think about it is it's a utopian aspect of North Korean psychology. They understand that they aren't actually self-reliant, that they do depend on imports and exports to some extent, but that's something that they want to achieve in the future. One of the things about communist regimes is it's almost always future oriented. It's almost always utopian in its political discourse and orientation. North Korea is no different. And so Juche is kind of the articulation of its proclamation of national autonomy and independence. And for the Black Panthers, they found this really appealing because the Black Panthers wanted to have self-sufficient Black communities that policed themselves, that fed themselves, and didn't need to rely on capitalist white America. And so that was really kind of the ideological connection between the Panthers and the North Korean leadership.
Dr. Benjamin, I just wonder, since we are talking about the Black Panther, is there any relations also with the Malcolm X with North Korea, or is there any effect of
No, Malcolm X, he died before the Black Panther North Korea relationship even started. So Malcolm X, really, as far as I know, never talked about North Korea. There wasn't really a connection between communist Korea and Malcolm X. Yeah.
You also wrote about imagining revolutionary feminism. This is also interesting part in the context of the Black Panther woman and communist Asia. So do you think, how did the DPRK's image of revolutionary womanhood, as in its propaganda and cultural diplomacy, impact the perspective of groups like the Black Panthers? So what kind of the effect and connection link we can find from here?
Yeah, for the Black Panthers, what they really advocated for was self-reliance and empowerment for the Black community. And there was also a gender aspect to the Black Panther Party as well, that they saw women as being equal comrades in the struggle. That wasn't always practiced by the Black Panther Party leadership, but they used communist Asia, so that's China, Vietnam, and North Korea, as basically depictions of what they saw as powerful role models in terms of gender equality, women as fighters, especially for Vietnam, and then women as like self-reliant revolutionary mothers, which is where the North Korea side kind of comes in. And the North Korean, when it comes to North Korea's representation of the ideal woman, a lot of it is tied to the domestic sphere, that they see women as being both the great homemaker, but also being flexible, being in the factory or being on the battlefield even. And so they're almost have like a dual burden, that they have to be, great mothers and great homemakers, but they also need to be everything else. And for the North Korea's ideal femininity, they look to women of the past, and the most famous being Kim Jong-suk, who was Kim Il-sung's wife. And then they never really talk a whole lot about Kim. They never talked about Kim Jong-il's wife, or and Kim Jong-un's wife has sometimes been pictured in the state media, but that isn't all that typical. She's not a huge aspect of North Korea's propaganda output.
And just jumping to the cultural diplomacy, you have studied the exportation of the mass games to the third world countries. What was the strategic goal of exporting the North Korea's cultural diplomacy, and how effective was it gaining legitimacy or influence for the regime abroad?
For North Korea, so first of all, North Korea, the mass games are this mass gymnastics event. When I went to North Korea in 2012, I actually attended it. It was about 100 euros actually at the time, on top of already extortionate tourist fee, and it was probably one of the most surreal experiences of my life. They usher you into this huge stadium. I think it's the Mayday Stadium. It's like it can fit like 120,000 people, and so you go in there. They like run you in, and it's already music is playing. There's thousands and thousands of performers. There's gymnasts. There's students in the background holding placards. That they basically orchestrate themselves in this mass kind of placard movement, so they can depict slogans and signs and drawings and posters. And it is a representation of collectivism, of uniformity, of discipline, of rigor. It is something to behold. It is also, I think, a representation of failure, that all this human energy has been put into something that won't really actually help these people. And I just think that all this collectivism, all this togetherness, that energy could be built for something so much better for humanity. But that's a different point. But North Korea during the Cold War era, they exported these mass games to other countries. And other countries are very interested in the mass games, specifically post-colonial countries in Africa, because they wanted to instill the same sort of discipline and rigor and collective fervor amongst their people. And so you had a number of sub-Saharan African countries, from Nigeria to Uganda to Botswana and Liberia. I mean, they weren't even just socialist countries. There was countries of all different political persuasions that were really interested in North Korea's mass games. Not on the same scale, but something similar. And so one of the things that North Korea did is that they actually sent mass games teachers and experts to these post-colonial countries to teach them how to do it. And so you can look at like the Zimbabwean primary school curriculum, and they still have mass games in their curriculum. And they still have some of these kind of North Korean influences that you can see. And so I just find that fascinating that North Korea had soft power. And as we all know today, South Korea has massive soft power. K-pop Demon Hunters is like #1 on Netflix for almost 3 months now. But we tend to forget that North Korea has a different kind of soft power. They like to weaponize their weirdness, as I know their North Korean expert sometimes likes to call it, and I think that's a good way of putting it. So with all that being said, North Korea's mass games, they just revitalized it recently. Kim Jong-un had a mass games for the Workers' Party. I think it's the 80th anniversary of its founding, something like that. But it's a really important part of North Korea's political culture and educational indoctrination for its young people. Yeah.
Okay, just for our live audiences, when we're talking about the Juche idea, how would you define Juche ideology, and how was it practically applied by North Korean advisors and ambassadors operating in Africa and Latin America, especially during the Cold War?
Yeah, so it's Juche. It means master of one's body, if you were to directly translate it. Sometimes it's directly translated as self-reliance, but that's not It's not technically right. And so Juche, during the Cold War era, it kind of went through several different forms. Initially, it was just applying Marxism-Leninism to Korean conditions. But then it became much more humanistic and much more kind of vague. And it was the dominant ideological vehicle for Kim Il-sung. And then it kind of got replaced in a lot of the discourse by Sung-gun under Kim Jong-il. And now under Kim Jong-un, for his first few years, it was Pyongyang, which means dual development and economic and military. And Sung-gun means military first. So it kind of went from self-reliance to military first politics to now dual development. But Juche has always been part of North Korea's official discourse and vernacular. And North Korea promoted it around the world. So there was Juche study groups set up in Africa and Latin America, and some of them are still around. But what I actually found in my research is some of them became vehicles for corruption. That North Korea was basically like sending money to some of these groups, and they'd be like, the North Korean diplomats would be like, "Can you publish this in a Liberian newspaper? We'll give you $100 to like publish it." And so what would happen is some of these Juche study groups would just take the money, or they would publish like one thing. But if you look at a lot of African newspapers in like the 60s and 70s, you can find propaganda ads for Kim Il-sung or the North Korean harvest. And they even went so far as to publish ads in major Western newspapers. So like the New York Times, they even published portraits of Kim Il-sung, official North Korean propaganda, in the New York Times in the ad section. So New York Times, Boston Globe, The Guardian, Washington Post. I actually was able to find some of these in the archives of these major Western newspapers. It's completely bizarre. And largely the organization that funded these Western ads was Chongryeon, which is a pro-DPRK ethnic Korean organization in Japan. So there's still overseas Koreans in Japan that were there during the colonial period, and they stayed there after, and they've always been kind of subjugated to like some racial discrimination in Japan. And so some of them are still very much tied to North Korea. And so there's an organization there called Chongryeon, and they're kind of like a mouthpiece of the Kim family regime in many regards. They're really important for revenue generation. They've been involved in nasty bits of corruption in the past. And they were the ones that I believe put these ads in the Western newspapers. But yeah, Juche study groups, they're still around. I'm sure they're extremely weird. I wouldn't recommend joining any, but if you're up for seeing something weird, then you can go to a Juche study group in your local neighborhood if you want.
And Dr. Benjamin, just a small point. Is it possible to say North Korea's propaganda is more active in Africa than Latin America? And why? Do you have an answer?
I don't know if it's more active in Africa than Latin America. Some of it is just like distance. You know, the Pacific separates North Korea from Latin America. It's not to say that Africa and Asia are close, but there is, North Korea just had more active presence in Africa than in Latin America. North Korea's real chief partner in Latin America is Cuba. And Cuba, largely it's because of the Castro regime and the revolutionary solidarity. They both saw themselves as being on the front line of the fight against U.S. imperialism. And the Cubans, they also they helped each other. So for example, there was a hurricane and flood in Cuba in the early 60s, and the North Koreans sent aid to the Cubans, and the Cubans have sent instructors and some aid to the North Koreans. So there's always been this kind of solidarity, but it recently has been really strained. And the reason is that South Korea and Cuba recently established official diplomatic relations. And so that is a great affront to North Korea's national dignity, that their best friend in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba, basically, I think what the North Koreans believe is they sold them out to be friends with their chief rival state, South Korea. But from the Cuban perspective, it makes total sense. I mean, the Cuban economy is terrible. A lot of it is because of the U.S. trade embargo. But the Cubans, I mean, they're trying to look for partners anywhere they can. And South Korea, with all of its chaebols and its economic power, is a natural ally, and it provides a lot more benefit than the North Koreans do in terms of just benefits and cooperation.
But still, I think the Pacific Ocean must be a reason, and geographical proximity in terms of the North Koreans' operations in Latin America.
Yeah. I mean, they
the huge body of water separates.
Yeah. It's the tyranny of the distance. I think for the North Koreans, what they're really right now focusing on their relationship with Russia. Their blood-soaked relationship in a military alliance with Putin's Russia, I think, has really caught a lot of people off guard. That North Korea, one of its first international efforts after the pandemic and 3+ years of total isolation, is that they really, really have heightened their efforts to connect with Russia, not just on the military front, in terms of sending soldiers and ammunition to Russia's war machine in Ukraine, but also establishing social, diplomatic, and cultural relationships with Russia. And I think that's something that doesn't get emphasized enough. And that's one of the reasons why I think North Korea, after the Ukraine war hopefully ends, is that their relationship with Russia has really been strengthened, and I don't think that's going to just stop.
In one of your work, you explores the role of anger and fear in U.S.-North Korea relations and the emotional relationship with countries like Zimbabwe. So how much the Pyongyang's foreign policy, from the Pueblo incident to the modern-day rhetoric, is driven by emotional political culture and rather than purely rational security interest, especially when encircled with the United States and just neighbor with the South Korea? What will be the role of emotional relations?
Yeah, so I think, North Korea, they use a lot of hyperbolic language and very emotional rhetoric. A few years ago, they said they were going to turn Seoul into a sea of fire. They referred to U.S. and South Korean presidents in all sorts of slurs, and it's very extreme language. It's excessive. It tends to be militaristic. But there's emotions behind that. And so, and it's also to say that the U.S. has a lot of emotions with North Korea, that there's kind of an emotional warfare between the two sides. And I think a lot of it is fear-based. For the North Koreans, I think there's a genuine fear of a U.S. Invasion. There's a genuine fear of U.S. covert efforts. There's a genuine fear of U.S. subversion of some sort. There's a genuine fear of regime collapse from U.S. influences. And they see South Korea as essentially a colony of the U.S. That is something that, to me, doesn't make sense, because South Korea is a fiercely independent country. But they really do see South Korea as a lackey of Washington. And then as far as the U.S. side, I think a lot of the fear is that this state has defied international norms and laws and has built a robust nuclear arsenal, and it's supposedly crazy. And so that conjures up a lot of fear amongst policymakers. And so I think there has always been this thing in the Washington Beltway network that North Korea was the one country that was able to basically overcome the nuclear threshold and overcome a lot of norms and achieve a nuclear arsenal that they will never, ever give up. And so I think there's some regret about that, some anger. And so this is where I think emotions plays a large role, especially in terms of the old hats that have been part of the North Korea discussion for many decades, whether it's in the intelligence community, the intelligence agencies, or whether it's in the more wonkish side. And for the North Korean leadership, I mean, those people don't change. They're there until like they're 30, until they have to be carried to their deathbed, essentially. There's no democratic elections there. But in terms of the security and intelligence apparatus in the U.S., I think there's still a lot of maybe anger and fear at that the North Korea situation has gotten so far out of hand in terms of its nuclear weapons program. This is a country that 20, 30 years ago, we were very fearful that they would have any nuclear weapons, that they were building a program, and now they have probably 50 to 80 nuclear bombs ready. And so they won. They, in some aspects, they won, and us Americans, we tend to be overconfident, and we tend to not like that feeling of losing.
And Dr. Benjamin, how do you think the North Koreans' experience in the Korean War changed its perception or future strategy toward its relations with China and Vietnam?
Yeah, so North Korea during the Korean War got bombed to oblivion, essentially. And so one of the things that North Korea learned from that is that they needed to build a lot of tunnels, and they needed to build a lot of things underground. And so North Korea has one of the most robust underground and subterranean networks in the world. There's some reports that actually helped Hezbollah build their tunnel structure and networks in Lebanon. So one of the things that I think that North Koreans took from the Korean War is we need to go underground and hide our military facilities. Another thing I think that they took from the Korean War is that we were the only ones that were able to basically bring the U.S. to its knees. And it's also important to note that the Korean War, it was the UN-led U.S. forces. It wasn't just U.S. forces, it was United Nations forces. And so I think there's always been an animosity towards international organizations such as the UN, that there's always been immense distrust because this was once the organization that tried to invade and overtake their sovereignty. And so I think that sometimes gets downplayed or forgotten. But I think it's an important thing to note is that these historical grievances and history plays a very large role in North Korean political culture. And it's one of the reasons why even after the Trump-Kim summits in Hanoi and Singapore, that there's still this very large buildup of propaganda on the North Korea side that's very anti-American, that's not going to be forgotten overnight by a bunch of brainwashed and highly indoctrinated North Koreans.
You compare the guerrilla warfare strategies of Mao and Kim Il-sung, General Giap and Che. What is the enduring legacy of the Kim Il-sung's and mountains warfare on North Korea's current military and political strategy, for example, in Ukraine, and sending military advisor, maybe even sometimes some news outlet mentioned that North Korea sending military advisor to Syria, I think, during the Syrian civil war.
Yeah, so my next book is about guerrilla warfare. And a lot of it, the impetus for me writing that book was I was teaching at the U.S. Naval War College, which is it basically is like an educational institute for young officers in the U.S. military to get a master's degree. And one of the things that was really surprising is that in this course I was teaching, I didn't come up with the syllabi. It was all approved by other instructors and by the government, was that they actually read military writings from Mao. And I find that so fascinating that U.S. military officers were reading Mao's military works. And I thought to myself, why are they doing that? And one of the things is that Mao is a theorist of guerrilla warfare. And then the thought after that is who else studied Mao from a military-centric perspective? And what I found is that Mao's military works were read by tons of people, not just ardent communists. They're read by Islamists. So even Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network, they actually found some of Mao's military writings during the global war on terror in Al-Qaeda compounds. There's been a lot of crossover with a number of other armed groups in the Middle East that have looked at Mao's writings and have referenced Mao. So some of the Palestinian groups. And so this is what I think it's fascinating that Mao, but also Che Guevara became part of this canon of guerrilla warfare and became kind of part of this literature that then became disseminated around the world as experiences to go back to. And so, yeah, and I think that's very important and applicable to today's current climate, because we as we saw in the Israel-Hamas conflict, is that guerrilla warfare and insurgency is still a part of modern day warfare. It's not going to go away, and we need to take that into account and not just focus on great power competition.
And Dr. Benjamin, do you believe that to what extent North Korea has a role in Hamas tunnel building and it is guerrilla warfare?
Yeah. So there's some reports that say that like North Korea helped Hamas, and I'm not sure how much of that is true. It might have been via Hezbollah that the North Koreans helped Hezbollah build the tunnels, which I do think is true, and then Hezbollah then helped the Hamas build their tunnels. So it might have been by proxy. But the North Koreans have been historically active in the Middle East. They helped Assad's regime in Syria build a nuclear reactor that the Israelis then bombed around 2006, 2007. North Korea used to have really close relations with Egypt. There were actually North Korean pilots that were active during the Yom Kippur War. So the North Koreans, as I said at the outset of our interview here, they're very internationalist when it comes to their own order, the global order. They're not going to, I think, ever be part of the global capitalist system using, SWIFT and other banking apps. But they are a very capable, resilient regime. And I think that's one of the things that American policymakers have to accept, is that this is a regime that isn't going to fall, that isn't going to collapse, it's going to be here for a very long period of time, and we need to take that into consideration.
Just make that small connection. Do you think how the North Koreans bring its guerrilla experience during the Cold War and translate all this experience into the cyber warfare and the cryptocurrency stolen, how it affect and how transfer its strategy?
Yeah. So North Korea, it is very experienced when it comes to cyber operations and cyber warfare. They have some of the most sophisticated hackers in the world. And the way that it's been described to me is that North Korea, because they don't have access to the World Wide Web, they see the internet as almost building a bike from the ground up. We outsiders, we get already presented the internet. It's almost like a bike that gets shipped to you from Amazon or from the internet, or you go to the store and you buy it. So it's already built. But the North Koreans essentially build the internet. And so they have a different perspective and a different way of approaching cyber operations. With that being said, North Korea, part of their savviness and part of the way they've been able to generate revenue for their highly sanctioned regime is that they basically have hacked into cryptocurrency exchanges. So they've taken advantage of the boom of crypto, which I think in many ways is a scam, but that's a different topic. But they've also taken advantage of the boom of remote working. So now you have North Korean IT workers posing as actual Americans or Westerners, and they're good workers. They know IT very well. And so they're gaining salaries, or they're also hacking into the systems of these really big multinational corporations, Microsoft, Intel, Google, and then they're able to not only take money for salaries, but they're also possibly and probably implementing malware and other viruses into the systems of these huge corporations, or stealing IP. So, and I think that this, you might be thinking, why would this regime do this kind of stuff? It's all very ticky-tack. But this is part of like North Korea's scrappiness, is that I don't think North Korea wants to be part of like the prototypical international community, or the international rules-based order, whatever you want to call it. I think they like being a renegade and a maverick. That's the only way they have been able. That's the only approach they've had to the world. And that goes into their relationship with Russia. I think Russia has become more like North Korea, and North Korea has become more like Russia. They've kind of intertwined the way that they see the world. They're paranoid. They're very fearful of outside influence. They're dictatorships. They have massive surveillance systems, massive secret police systems. So, it's unfortunate, but it doesn't surprise me that Putin's Russia has been North Korean in many respects. And I think we're only going to see a hardening of that in Russia. And I think North Korea, I think they see so many benefits out of their relationship with Russia. They get money, they get oil, they get food, they get experience on the battlefield in modern warfare. They didn't know what to do with drones before. Now they know how to not only shoot down drones, but they know how to build drones. And so this is going to really help them in the case of a conflict in the Korean Peninsula. And I think that's probably the grand strategy of the North Koreans. I don't think they actually want to take over South Korea. They can't. Physically, they don't have enough people. But I think they want to subjugate and dominate South Korea, and on a military and a military aspect. And I think they would like the U.S. and South Korea to have a weakening of the alliance, so that they can basically infiltrate and increase the chances for a total subjugation of South Korea. But this is a long-term strategy, in my opinion.
In one of your paper, you mentioned North Korea's current dealings with some of the African unexpected cozy relations with Singapore. So, what is the primary function of these ongoing, seemingly disparate and global connections, and how vital are they to regime sanctions and avoiding a strategy?
Say that question one more time. I'm sorry.
I said, sometimes North Korea has some opposite relations. For example, on one hand, has a relationship with the African countries, and on other hand, it has cozy relations with the Singapore. So, these opposite relations, how help North Korea to avoid the sanctions, and what kind of benefit they gain from this cozy relationship, especially with Singapore and compare with African countries?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of what they're doing with Singapore now. North Korea, as I've said before, very focused on its relationship with Russia. That's really, I think they're trying to probably get off some of their total dependence on China for external trade and imports. It makes sense from a realistic IR perspective. But in terms of their revenue generation, the North Korean economy is not a typical economy. They don't look at the economy in terms of the standard things that other Western industrialized countries do, like unemployment or the stock market. That's not important to the North Korean leadership. This is a country that devotes 20 to 30% roughly of their GDP to their military. North Korean men have to spend 10 years in the North Korean military. There's no unemployment really in North Korea, because if you don't work and if you don't try your hardest, you're going to starve. In the North Korean system, it's not gentle. This is a system that let roughly 600,000 of their own people starve to death in the mid-1990s. So all of their talk about a people first mentality, a wonderful socialist system. This is a system that is designed to basically weed out the weaker people and leave them to starve on the streets. And some of this kind of brutal aspect of the regime results, I think, in a very corruptible system. I think it also results in a very difficult system to penetrate in terms of information. It's a country that is very isolated when it comes to the information landscape. And especially after the pandemic proved to be kind of a golden opportunity for North Korea to enhance its firewalls, to not only literally build cyber defenses, but build literally border walls. So now there's even fewer North Korean defectors going to China than escaping to South Korea. So this is this kind of hardening of North Korean borders is not only in physical space, but also in the cyberscape as well.
Dr. Ben, driving your analysis from the past history of the North Korea, its relations with the other continents, other countries, and its experience during the Cold War. When we combine all this experience, what kind of the motion drive North Korea to build nuclear weapons?
Yeah, what drove North Korea to build nuclear weapons? That's a highly debated question among scholars and historians of North Korea. Some say it was actually the Korean War, the brutal Arab bombardment. That's what persuaded the North Koreans. There's no smoking gun document saying that this one event caused the North Koreans to adopt nuclear weapons. My feeling is that it was probably a sequence of events. So it was, it was kind of accumulated historical experiences, the Korean War, but also the Cuban Missile Crisis, the fact that they saw Soviets as abandoning their Cuban brothers, I think played a role. They thought that the Soviets basically abandoned Havana and Castro. And at the time, Cuba and North Korea were really very, very close in the early 1960s. And so I don't think they ever fully trusted the Soviet Communist Party to come into their aid in the event of a U.S. invasion. And then they really distrusted Maoist China. They thought the Cultural Revolution was crazy. And then you have Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, and I think that was really the nail in the coffin. That's when they really accelerated their nuclear development program, because they thought that socialism with a human face was a great affront to Marxist Leninism and was going to be a disaster. And the North Koreans, one of the lessons they took from the collapse of the Soviet Union was that you need to be self-reliant. And that meant to them having nuclear weapons. And then they saw what happened to Libya. They saw what happened to Gaddafi. They saw what happened to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And they weren't best friends with Saddam Hussein by any stretch of the imagination. But they did not want to end up like them. They did not want to be, the Kim family didn't want to be dragged through the streets of Pyongyang, beaten to death by people's shoes. So that, I think, is also at the back of their mind. But I think it was largely these historical experiences, and it was kind of accumulating. And the fact that I think they saw their greatest partner, their chief patron, the Soviet Union, collapse literally bloodless overnight. And I think that to them was a great existential threat. It's no surprise that China and Cuba focused so much on learning the lessons from the Soviet collapse because they don't want their own parties to suffer the same fate. And the North Koreans have also studied the collapse of the Soviet Communist Party, because that really changed the trajectory of international relations in the 20th and 21st centuries.
Dr. Ben, I think time run out of time. Just there is a interesting question here. I will just bring on the screen. You can just maybe keep in your mind and answer all them together. This is important. Switzerland in Pyongyang's international relations today. Yes, this is about one of the questions from Sukanto.
About how important is Switzerland.
Yeah. Just let me bring all this together because of the time's restraint. And Diva, what roles have the Macau and Hong Kong territories played in facilitating North Korea's overseas networks? How they adapted amid tightening international sanctions? This question about the Macau and Hong Kong. Elsa, 2017 assassination of the Kim Jong-nam in Kuala Lumpur, in the modern North Korean history. Why Malaysia was chosen as the location for this operation? Yes, it's an interesting question. Will you have any answer of this?
Yeah, so I'll tackle the last one first. So that's a good question from Elsa. So with Malaysia, North Koreans still have visa-free travel to a number of countries, and Malaysia at the time was a visa-free travel destination for North Koreans, and North Korea has an embassy there. And so the North Korean embassies abroad, they're not typical embassies. There's almost always some nefarious thing going on there, whether it's like ivory trafficking, which is what the North Koreans have done in Africa, or some sort of nefarious activity. For example, in the 1970s in Scandinavia, North Korean diplomats were trafficking counterfeit cigarettes and hashish. And so in Malaysia, there was an active DPRK embassy, and so they were able to operate out of that. Also, historically, Malaysia and North Korea have been quite tight. There wasn't a whole lot of animosity between the two. And so I think it went under the radar. But that whole assassination of Kim Jong-un's half-brother is like something out of a Cold War spy novel. It's nuts. And as far as these other questions about like Macau, Hong Kong, and Switzerland, with Switzerland, that's where Kim Jong-un went to school. And
also
he went
his
to school.
Sister.
Say again?
His sister also studied in Switzerland. Am I right?
I'm not sure. But, Switzerland, it is known as like the international.
For the family, is the educational destination or also there is something about the financial?
I don't know. I think all I know for certain is that Kim Jong-un went there to school, but I don't think there's no sort of like robust North Korean Swiss relationship. But Switzerland has always prided itself on being non-aligned and neutral. And as far as like Macau and Hong Kong, North Korea and Macau and Hong Kong, I think there has been some nefarious North Korean illicit activities operating out of Macau. I forgot what, but I think there was a huge bank that the North Koreans traffic funds through that the Americans then sanctioned. I think it was Bank Delta Asia. And that operated out of Macau and Hong Kong. But, when it comes to those territories or any sort of these territories for China, the North Koreans always tote the Chinese line. They never really stray far from what the Chinese say about this. So when it comes to like Taiwan, for instance, China or North Korea always totes the Chinese line. And even with Russia and Ukraine, North Korea totes the Russian line. For example, they were one of the first countries to officially recognize the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics as sovereign nations. And it was only like Assad, Syria, Russia, and North Korea that actually recognized those fake puppet states. And so this is, North Korea, they use diplomacy to to speak to the world in some respects. And they're able to say, as I said before, kind of weaponize some of their uniqueness.
And just last question, Dr. Benjamin. Based on your deep analysis of the North Korean history, especially during the Cold War, what is the one of the historical factor that Western policymakers most consistently misunderstand about North Korea, and what is the biggest surprise you have encountered in your research that should change how we view the DPRK today?
Yeah, it's a good final question. I think one of the things that we really misunderstand about North Korea is that it's some sort of crazy, irrational regime. But this is a country that, and a party that has outlived the Soviet Communist Party. And so you don't survive for this long if you're crazy, and you don't survive for this long if you're irrational. But that's also to say that this is not a regime that's just solely focused on survival. And I think that also gets underplayed, is that I think there is a grand strategy for the North Koreans. There is a long-term playbook. And I think that is very much premised on having nuclear weapons. So I hope that is something interesting to leave watchers on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benjamin, for this terrific conversation about one of the most interesting country in the world. Thank you for sharing your expertise and time with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ben. Yes, we come to end of one of most interesting conversation today. I forgot to promote Dr. Ben's one of most interesting book about North Korea. Just let me show for our audiences. If you are interested in North Korean studies, you can find these books, Guns, Guerrillas, and The Great Leader. You can order the book on Amazon, hard copy, whether a soft copy you want. And please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for Global Power Dynamics. We have more surprising programs in the future. Please don't forget to subscribe to channel and push the notification bell whenever we go to the live, and you will receive the notification about our conversation. And thank you very much again for joining us today, for watching our conversation.